The road is loud. Palm branches slash the air. People are screaming. Cloaks hit the dirt. Someone in Apos' only coat, thrown down like a red carpet for a king they have been waiting 400 years to see. A donkey picks its way through the crowd, and on the donkey and Apos' back sits a man from Galilee, and the crowd below him is losing its mind with joy. And the man is weeping. Not quietly. Luke uses the word klavmos, the ugly grief word, the kind that shakes your chest and makes sound. This is not a single tear on a composed face. This is the kind of crying you do when something you love is already gone, even if no one else knows it yet. The crowd has no idea. They see a king arriving. He sees a city dying. This is not a story about a sensitive man who cried at sunsets. This is not a story about religious emotion or a soft Jesus who patted people on the head and told them everything would be fine. This is not even a story about the shortest verse in the Bible, though that verse is where we begin. This is a story about 3 specific moments. 3 times the God of the universe broke down in grief, and what each breakdown reveals about the kind of God he actually is. Because here is what nobody tells you about the tears of Jesus. They were not all the same. The Greek language, which recorded every word of the New Testament with surgical precision, used different words for different kinds of weeping. And when you look at what word was used at each moment, the tomb, the city, the garden, the picture that emerges is not gentle. It is not soft. It is the portrait of someone who loved with the specific, personal, devastating intensity of a parent watching the thing they love most walk toward a door they cannot close. There are 3 moments, 3 different griefs. And there is one moment, one specific night in a garden, when the disciples were asleep and the ground was cold, and the only sound was his own voice breaking, where the tears of Jesus were not about anyone else at all. They were entirely, devastatingly his own. We will get there. But not yet. The first time Jesus wept, a man named Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. 4 days matters. In first-century Jewish tradition, the soul was believed to hover near the body for 3 days after death, lingering, reluctant to leave. By day 4, it was gone. By day 4, the mourners who had gathered from Jerusalem to the village of Bethany knew there was nothing left to hope for. The body had already begun to decompose. Martha said it plainly when Jesus asked them to roll back the stone, and quote, "Lord, by this time there is a bad odor," end quote. This is not a polished funeral scene. This is a burial cave in the heat of Judea, and death is doing what death does. Jesus knew Lazarus was dead before he arrived. He knew it when the messenger first came to him 2 days earlier, and he stayed where he was anyway. He told his disciples plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there." He already knew what he was going to do. He was going to walk up to that sealed tomb and call a dead man back to life by name. He knew the ending, and he wept anyway. This is the detail that stops everything. When Mary, Lazarus and Apos' sister, the one who had sat at Jesus and Apos' feet and anointed him with perfume worth a year and Apos' wages, when Mary fell at his feet in the dirt and said, end quote, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died," end quote. The text says something remarkable. It says Jesus saw her weeping. He saw the crowd weeping around her. And then it says he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. That phrase, deeply moved, is a translation of the Greek word embrameomai. And embrameomai does not mean gently sad. In classical Greek, embrameomai was used to describe the sound a warhorse makes before a charge, the snort, the held-back fury, the power compressed into a single breath before release. It is a word for controlled rage. Ancient commentators used it for indignation. Some translators render it groaned in his spirit. But the weight of the word is anger, not at Mary, not at the crowd, but at the thing that made them weep. Death. He was furious at death. The creator of life, standing at the door of death and Apos' work, looking at what it had done to people he loved. And the word the Holy Spirit chose to describe his inner state was a warhorse before the charge. Then John chapter 11, verse 35. The shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. But here the Greek shifts. The word is no longer embrameomai. The word is edakrusin, which means to shed tears silently, quietly, not the loud wailing of the crowd, not the chest-shaking grief of the mourners, just tears moving down his face in silence. He was furious, and he was grieving, and he held both at the same time. And here is where the crowd splits. Some of them saw those tears and said, and quote, "See how he loved him," and quote. They read the grief correctly. They saw a man weeping for his friend, and they understood, this is love. This is what love looks like when it loses someone. But others in the crowd said something else. They said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Same tears. Two completely different readings. One group saw love. The other group saw failure. Stay with me, because this matters more than it seems. The people who saw failure were not wrong to ask the question. It is the right question. If you can heal blindness, why did you let your friend die? If you are who you say you are, where were you? The question is honest. The question is the one every person who has ever prayed and been met with silence has asked in one form or another. And Jesus does not answer it with words. He answers it by walking to the tomb. He answers it by telling them to roll away the stone. Over the objections of people who know the smell of 4-day-old death. He answers it by lifting his eyes and praying out loud, not for himself, but for the crowd. "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe." And then he shouts into the darkness of the cave with the full weight of everything he is. "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man walks out, still wrapped in burial cloths, blinking in the Judean sun. The tears were real. The power was real. Both existed at the same time, in the same person, standing in the same dirt outside the same tomb. This is the first thing the tears of Jesus reveal. He does not bypass your grief to get to your miracle. He enters it. He stands in it with you. He lets it move him, genuinely, physically, with tears on his face, before he does anything about it. The God who knew the ending still wept at the middle. He was not performing sadness for the crowd. He was moved. Embrameamai, the warhorse fury at death. Edacrucin, the quiet tears of a man who loved someone. Full stop. If you have ever stood at a grave and wondered whether any of it mattered, whether the God you prayed to felt anything about the thing that broke you, the answer is in those two Greek words. He felt it. He felt it as fury and he felt it as grief. And he felt them both at once, standing in the same place you were standing. The tomb was not the end of the story for Lazarus, but the garden will come later. First, there is a city. Here is what most people miss. 2 tears down. 1 to go. A tomb outside Bethany. A dead man walking out in burial cloths. Quiet tears on the face of someone who already knew the ending, and wept anyway. But the second time Jesus wept, he was not standing at a grave. He was sitting on a donkey above a cheering crowd. And the grief word Luke chose for that moment is the loud one. The ugly one. The one that shakes your whole body. The third one, in the garden, alone, with no crowd and no miracle waiting at the end. That is the one that will change how you read everything else. If this is landing for you, subscribe. We are just getting started. The second time Jesus wept, nobody noticed at first. It was Palm Sunday, the most jubilant day in the ministry of Jesus. The road into Jerusalem was packed. People had heard he raised a man from the dead 4 days after burial, and the word spread the way wildfire spreads in dry grass. By the time he crested the Mount of Olives on a borrowed donkey, the crowd had reached critical mass. Cloaks on the road. Palm branches. The ancient coronation chant, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, echoing off the limestone walls of the city below. The disciples were euphoric. This was the moment. Their rabbi, finally, publicly, entering the holy city like a king. And Luke chapter 19, verse 41 records what Jesus was doing at that exact moment. As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it. Not at a crucin this time. Not the quiet, flowing tears of Bethany. The word Luke uses is kleo, and the form here carries the full weight of klathmos, the loud, uncontrollable, chest-heaving grief. The kind of crying that makes sound. The kind you cannot hide, cannot compose your way through, cannot perform for an audience. Jesus was sobbing, above a cheering crowd, on a donkey, in broad daylight, and he spoke through it. He said, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God and Apos as coming to you." He was not speaking metaphor. He was describing a siege. Pay attention to this. In the year 70 AD, 40 years after Jesus wept those words from the back of a donkey, the Roman general Titus surrounded Jerusalem with 4 legions and cut off every supply line into the city. Josephus, the Jewish historian who was present and recorded the destruction in meticulous detail, wrote that the famine inside the walls became so severe that mothers did things no pen should record. When the walls finally broke, the Romans moved through the city street by street. Josephus estimated that over 1,100,000 people died. The temple, the center of Jewish worship, the house where God and Apos' name dwelled, was burned to the ground. The stones were pulled apart to recover the melted gold. Not one stone left on another. Jesus saw all of it from that donkey. Every body, every burned street, every child. And he wept before any of it happened, because he loved the city that was going to destroy itself by refusing to recognize the one thing that could have saved it. This is a different grief than Bethany. At the tomb, Jesus wept for people who were weeping with him, Mary at his feet, mourners around him. The grief was shared, mutual, warm even in its pain. On the road into Jerusalem, Jesus wept alone. The crowd was celebrating. The disciples were dreaming of what came next. Nobody else on that road saw what he saw. He carried the foreknowledge of 1,000,000 deaths through a cheering crowd, and not one person around him knew he was grieving. There is a kind of loneliness in that image that is almost unbearable. Here is the part nobody tells you. This was not the first time he had tried. In Luke chapter 13, before Palm Sunday, Jesus had looked toward Jerusalem and said, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. How often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing." A hen gathers her chicks. In the ancient Near East, farmers knew exactly what this looked like. When a hawk circled overhead or fire broke out in dry grass, a mother hen would spread her wings flat to the ground and call. Her chicks would run from every direction and press under those wings, into the darkness, into the warmth, into safety they could not provide for themselves. The hen would absorb whatever came. The chicks would survive because she did not move. He said, "I wanted to be that for you, and you were not willing." The historian Eusebius, writing in the early 4th century, recorded that when the Roman armies first began to move toward Jerusalem, the Christians in the city, who had heard and remembered the warning Jesus gave on that road, fled to a town called Pella across the Jordan. They survived. The people who dismissed the warning, the ones who stayed, were caught in the siege. His tears, on that road, were also a warning. Some people, 40 years later, remembered them and lived. The grief of Jesus over Jerusalem is not ancient history. It is the grief of someone who sees exactly where a road leads, loves the people walking it, and weeps because he cannot force them to turn around. He can only spread his wings. He can only call. Whether they come is not up to him. If you have ever loved someone who was walking towards something that was going to break them, and they would not listen, and you could not stop them, and all you could do was watch, you have felt the shadow of what Jesus felt on that road. That is the second grief. The third one is coming. And before this video ends, subscribe, because next week we go inside the moments of Scripture that most teachers skip entirely. You do not want to miss what is coming. Now we get to the garden. Everything before this, the tomb, the city, the crowds, the miracles, all of it has been building toward one night on a hillside outside Jerusalem, in an olive grove called Gethsemane. The word Gethsemane comes from the Aramaic Gachmanim, oil press, a place where olives are crushed to release what is inside them. The name was not accidental. It was late. The Passover meal was finished. Judas had already left the table. Jesus led the remaining 11 disciples through the city gate, across the Kidron Valley, where the temple priests dumped the blood of thousands of sacrificial animals, so that the valley ran red during Passover, and up into the grove of olive trees on the slope of the Mount of Olives. He left 8 disciples near the entrance. He took Peter, James, and John deeper in. And then he said something that should stop every reader cold. Matthew chapter 26, verse 38. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." Not sad, not heavy, to the point of death. The Greek word is paralipos, a sorrow so total it wraps around you on every side. No gap, no air. Paralipos was used in ancient literature for the kind of grief that could physically kill a person. Jesus was not using poetic language. He was describing a physiological reality. Luke, who was a physician, adds the clinical detail in chapter 22. His sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. Modern medicine has a name for this: hematidrosis. It occurs under conditions of extreme psychological stress. The capillaries near the sweat glands rupture. The blood mingles with the sweat. He was not performing anguish. His body was breaking under the weight of what was coming. And here is where the open loop closes, because this is the moment Hebrews chapter 5, verse 7 is describing when it says, "During the days of Jesus and Apos, life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death." Fervent cries and tears, not the quiet Edacrucin of Bethany, not the Clovmos of the Palm Sunday road. Something the writer of Hebrews could only call Eschairus Decius, strong cryings, powerful pleadings, the kind of prayer that costs everything to make. At Lazarus and Apos' tomb, he wept for a friend. Over Jerusalem, he wept for a city. In the garden, he wept for himself. This is the grief nobody wants to sit with, because it is the most human thing Jesus ever did. Not the miracles, not the teaching. This, lying face down in the dirt of an olive grove, asking his father if there was any other way, while the disciples he asked to stay awake slept 10 yards behind him. He prayed 3 times, each time the same words: "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." 3 times. The same number Peter would deny him before morning. Think about what you are looking at. This is not a man going through the motions of humanity for a divine audience. This is not God pretending to feel what he does not feel. The writer of Hebrews is precise about this. He learned obedience from what he suffered, not performed obedience. Learned through suffering, real suffering that had to be walked through one agonizing step at a time, with no shortcut and no exemption. I want you to picture something. You are a parent. Your child is walking towards something catastrophic, something you can see clearly and they cannot or will not. You know what is at the end of that road. You could stop them, technically, but stopping them would mean something worse for someone else, someone you also love. And so you stand at the edge of what you can bear and you let it happen. You watch them go. That is not a perfect analogy. No analogy is. But it is the closest human experience to what the Father watched in that garden, his Son, face down in the dirt of a world the Father made, asking if there was any other way. And the answer, given in silence, was no. There was no other way. And Jesus stood up. He woke the disciples. He said, "Rise. Let us go. Here comes my betrayer." His face was still wet. His sweat still carried traces of blood. And he walked out of the garden to meet Judas and the soldiers and everything that came after, not because the grief had passed, but because love was stronger than the grief. He did not dry his tears before he went to the cross. He went with them still on his face. 3 moments, 3 different griefs. One person. At the tomb of Lazarus, he wept quietly. Edacrucin, the silent tears of someone who loved a friend and felt the full weight of losing him, even knowing the ending. At the road into Jerusalem, he sobbed. Clovmos, the uncontrollable grief of someone watching a city walk toward its own destruction, unable to stop it, unwilling to look away. And in the garden, alone in the dirt with blood in his sweat and no disciples awake to witness it, he cried out with his whole body, Eschairus Decius, strong cryings, the prayer that costs everything. Here is what those 3 moments tell you. First, he is not distant from your pain. He is not watching from a safe altitude, unmoved, waiting for you to compose yourself before he responds. He entered grief. He stood in it. He let it move him to fury and to tears and to the ground itself. Whatever you are carrying today, the grave you are standing at, the city you are watching burn, the garden you are sitting in alone, he has already wept there. Specifically, by name. Second, his tears did not mean nothing was coming. At Lazarus and Apos' tomb, he wept and then called a dead man out of the dark. Over Jerusalem he sobbed and then walked into the city anyway. In the garden he cried out with everything he had and then stood up and went to the cross. The grief was real. So was what came after it. Weeping is not the end of the story. It never has been. Third, and this is the one I want you to carry out of this video. The shortest verse in the Bible is 2 words. Jesus wept. For 2,000 years people have treated it as a trivia question, the shortest verse, a footnote, a curiosity. But it is not a trivia question. It is a door. On one side of that door is a God who is above your pain, outside your grief, untouched by the things that are destroying you. On the other side is a God who got dirt on his knees in a garden and blood in his sweat and tears on his face, and went to the cross anyway, still wet. Walk through the door. Which of the three moments hit you hardest? The tomb, the city, or the garden? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if this is the kind of content you have been looking for, the kind that goes underneath the surface of the text and does not come back up until it has found something real, subscribe. There is more coming. He wept. He stood up. He went. And he is not finished yet.